Father de Souza, thank you very much for joining us on this virtuality. It's a treat to talk to you.
Good to be with you. I have to say, for our listeners who may have had the pleasure of listening to us on Cross Country Checkup, I think video is a step backwards in the case for both of us.
I think in my case, it's a horror for the audience. I can tell you that even from the television days.
Sometimes less is more.
Absolutely. I'm not a fan of this, even though I'm doing it. So there you go. Yes, I notice behind you, there's a rather wonderful picture.
Right.
That's John Paul II. If from this distance and virtuality, I can identify it. Do you have much contact with him? One of the largest personalities, probably of the century.
Right,
What was your feelings about him, or your understanding of him?
It's an original painting, actually, done by a Canadian artist, Cyril Leeper, a very accomplished portrait artist who's done some distinguished personages in our Canadian scene. It's actually John Paul on October 22nd, 78, the beginning of his pontificate, and he's being greeted there by Joseph Ratzinger, who ended up being his successor. So that's why I've got that painting. I had the honor to meet now St. John Paul II several occasions, but only ever to greet him as, one of a group, never to have a conversation. But he had an enormous impact on my life, as he did for many.
Yeah.
Reading his works and following his ministry, and he was decisive in my own vocation to the priesthood. I mean, it's possible, obviously, God could have used another means, but in the history of my small life, he had a great impact, and in the history of the larger world, he also had a great impact.
Yeah, it is, especially in the second half of the 20th century, which I suppose, at least in Western ethos, the religious figures didn't have that almost automatic high prestige, perhaps, I'm assuming, they had in earlier times. But here was this man certainly at the beginning of his serving, of immense vigor, both intellectual and physical. And he threw, and it's a word that comes more from faith than anywhere else, he threw such a powerful charisma that he changed world events, even on the practical political level.
Well, he certainly did. Of course, the very fact of his presence, a pope from behind the Iron Curtain, was a challenge to that whole communist system. And he was elected in October 78, and by October 1989, 11 years later, it was all over. And without any violence, the whole communist system was dismantled. So it was a providential moment. He wasn't the only figure, obviously, but he was a consequential one. And I think probably if you were to assign a figure, the most consequential historical figure of the first half of the 20th century, it would likely be Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
Obviously FDR, very important, but probably Churchill. And probably the second half of the 20th century would be John Paul II, I think, in terms of secular history. Now, of course, in the life of the church, it's a different measuring stick, but certainly in the whole 2,000-year history of the papacy, he would belong amongst the most consequential, and there have been some very consequential figures in that history. So,
would he be, hadn't intended to go this way, would he have been one of the swiftest to achieve the designation saint among the great history of the popes?
It was about 9 years after he died in April 2005. He was canonized in 2014. Now, the rules for canonization have been revised several times. And so there were periods in history where it was almost by acclamation of the people. And then for many years, there was a 50-year waiting period, which John Paul himself abolished in the early 80s and reduced it to 5 years. He wanted more saints that were contemporaries of the people who they would have remembered. So, certainly under the current rules, the fastest. But historically, there have been other, there are other rules in different times and places. So
we've been, I'm switching rather violently to another topic. we've been now, as I'm talking to you, just about a full year under these COVID restrictions, protocols, whatever you care to call them. What impact is all this having in two major terrains? The terrain of private psychology, we're not the health part we'll all agree on, but all this isolation, the cancellation of daily function, the ruination of so many businesses, and secondly, the experiencing over so long a period of time of the restrictions on normal liberties that accompany the health protocols. How do you think this is seeping into, I think, of our own country?
I would say in those first few months, I heard and read often people saying, what will the mental health consequences be? And I'll be frank, I was a bit skeptical that it would be that the toll would be so great. And maybe if it had ended after, 3 or 4 weeks or a couple of months, maybe I would have been right. But certainly a year in, I would say probably starting last fall, I started to hear more just anecdotally from students, parishioners, that they're just having a very difficult time of it. And not just that they were, chafing to get out, but just that they were alone, they were isolated. We're not meant to live that way. And so there certainly is quite a toll. Now, after, whatever, I think probably about the 10 or 11 month mark, so probably, December, January, we began to see now the actual statistics come in. Drug overdose deaths way up, suicides,
yes.
Not necessarily suicides way up, but people dealing with suicide distress, that sort of thing, or suicidality, they call it. Those things are quite up. And of course, when you see those measures, which are at the extreme, you know that behind them is a long tail of trouble. But just anecdotally, it's very difficult. And, especially for people who have been isolated literally in their homes, their grown children and their grandchildren, coming out to stand in the yard or whatever.
Yeah.
But still, I said they found it very, very difficult. On the freedom side of it, I think that there are lesser freedoms and more fundamental freedoms, and I think that we've made a mistake in the country in that the fundamental freedoms have to be abrogated for as short a period and as light a way as possible. And I think at the beginning, I was quite willing to be understanding that dealing with something you didn't know about, you put these blanket restrictions on. But I think actually after 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, for some of the fundamental freedoms, and I would have to extend that to the idea of a curfew, you have to reach a very high threshold. And I think, like in the province of Quebec, to say that the entire province, which includes, downtown Montreal and, Lac Saint Jean and, the deserted Gaspé region, or in Ontario, where in Kingston, where I am, we've had 1 COVID death, the entire year. We've been very blessed in that sense. But that we would have the same restrictions as downtown Toronto, I think that I think was more understandable at the beginning. I would have to say now, a year in, we've become a little bit too comfortable. I would say with restricting fundamental freedoms without a very clear and demonstrable set of criteria. It shouldn't just be the premier or the provincial cabinet in consultation with the health officials just announcing it. I'm not really disagreeing so much with the actual decision, but you have to justify it with much more than what we've seen. And that I think builds, quite frankly, a bad habit that becomes a bit cavalier about fundamental liberties.
I think that is the key point. I agree with you. I just want to underline this. Not in a position to make judgments on medical prescriptions, medical protocols. At the same time, the variety of them that we have received across all jurisdictions, federal, provincial, and territorial, and also the variance within certain provinces. These are all very casual. Secondly, I fully agree with you that since the beginning of this thing, we started, if you remember, we must flatten the curve, and it might take all of 2 weeks. And as time extended and simple announcements were made as to what could happen and what could not happen, accustomizing ourselves so complacently to those things is a very worrisome thing, because once you get used to a certain regime, I'm using the word in its technical sense, then it's easier to go a little harder. Finally, and I'll put this in there now, you mentioned, and I'm glad you did, or stressed rather, fundamental freedoms. And one of the fundamental freedoms that you're well situated to discuss is the freedom of religion and the freedom of expressing one's religion and participating in one's religion. I'm not being coy here, and I'm not being dismissive. We can have the supermarkets open, and we can have certain big box stores, but churches and pastors are starting to see that congregating, choose the word, not so. I think we're altogether too casual, even in the middle of what can be described as a crisis, watching these things, as you say, by simple fiat, either through cabinet or medical officer, or in some cases, we're not sure which. We just haul the switch down and turn them all off.
Yeah, I would mention, you've been quite clever in describing the prime ministerial diktats being issued from the tent of commons, as you put it there, Rideau Cottage. I think that these measures, and when we have parliaments,
Yes.
I've been quite distressed actually that in an emergency that the parliaments don't sit.
That's the point.
I think that a parliament should sit. And if the premier or the cabinet proposes some restriction under the Emergencies Act, or actually as has been the case in Canada under the Quarantines Act and other analogous legislation, to have a day or two to debate it, that seems to be a healthy democratic impulse. The idea that everybody waits for 3 p.m. and the premier comes out and just announces how the lives of the entire population are going to be regulated, I don't think that's a healthy democratic instinct. Well, it's not. And quite frankly, I might be quite happy to accept the actual, if you want to say the actual protocol, but I think the process has been democratically lacking. As far as the churches have gone, I think that in general, the churches, when I say in general, I would say 98% of churches in the country have been very cooperative, have put in all kinds of restrictions to meet whatever the protocols are. And there's been a little bit of tension on a few things, but I would say this on religious liberty: if there are going to be restrictions on gatherings of a certain kind, in certain capacities, whatever, if they apply generally speaking across the board, then there isn't a religious liberty issue, at least at the beginning.
Yeah.
Where the problem really arises is when there's differential treatment.
Yep.
We have seen that, and I'll give you one example, which is in the province of British Columbia, which has had a very severe lockdown since November. And if you have a parish church, you're very limited. And in fact, many of them in the Catholic world had closed down to services. But if in the parish hall or basement, which might be smaller than the church itself, you had an Alcoholics Anonymous group meeting, the government said that's essential. I can understand why they would say that.
Yeah, sure.
So you could have 12 people downstairs, but you couldn't have 5 people upstairs. And that kind of arbitrariness is contrary to, I think, good constitutional and good democratic governance. And on that point, by the way, the BC Civil Liberties Association, which is not generally, shall we say, friendly towards religious causes, has made a statement anyway about that in favor of the church's liberty to carry on at least with the same number of people as other things. So I don't object so much, and we've observed them in my parish. We've observed absolutely scrupulously all of the directions. I think our people want that. I want it. Our Archbishop wants it. So we're very cooperative. But I would say that the process of circumscribing fundamental liberties has to be done with more explanation. And I think actually some democratic debate. I don't accept that the whole country just has to wait until some minister of the crown gets up and says, okay, this is how it's going to be. That's not a democratic way of doing things.
I'm glad you re-emphasized that. It really is peculiar. I know I've said it, not that that matters, but that the most severe experience that Canada has had, perhaps since the Second War, and I'm not being hyperbolic there, medically obvious, I think, and certainly, and we don't know the full range of that yet, but I think there's a big reckoning coming. The economic devastations that are going on and are not yet being fully measured when we finally walk out of this thing. But overall, the governance, the leadership, and I'm not picking on any particular party, they're rationalizing it in public, having a full debate about what are the constituent elements of the political system. The freedoms are prior to all else. And to have it over the course of an entire year, we get statements about here's the new ruling. I don't think I'm wrong in saying this, both premiers and the prime minister. I don't think any one of the leaders has stood up for half an hour on public television and other fora to say, here's where we are, folks. Here's our thinking on it. Here's the way that we're going about making these decisions. We really do want to get some genuine response from you, the public, as to how you think we're dealing with it. We had Parliament virtually disemboweled. And the reason that I picked particularly on religious freedom here, because that has yet another element, what you were talking about earlier, the other impact that this has had on people's psychology and people's well-being. Religion is a tremendous support. That's what it exists for, of the human spirit. And so restricting religious things should have been something explained more deeply or more elaborately than the restrictions on ordinary activities.
I would agree with that and say that, Canadians have been very, I think, cooperative. One might even say obedient. We know that because if there's one or two people in the entire country who are offside, it makes the news. I mean, there's not thousands. We know almost who their names are. So I think that's, I think it's the process that I would stress. I would also add another aspect of it which worries me, which is that I think the pandemic has revealed quite the opposite of what most people have commented on, namely that the people may be losing trust in their leaders because this or that aspect was not handled well. But I think the leaders have lost trust in the people. So you have these very wide-ranging rules come out that don't allow for, if you want to say, the responsible agency of the people. So, if you're running a diner in Timmins and, there are no cases in your area, the fact that a ruling from Toronto has shut you down, instead of saying, well, look, actually, if in your area there are fewer than X cases, you make your decisions. Now, immediately people say, well, what if someone does such and such? But that's because they've lost trust in the people. And I think some of these rules have really lost trust that the people, whether it's in their businesses, whether it's in their schools, whether it's in their churches and so forth, can make decisions for the common good. The presumption has been that you will not be allowed to make a decision because some people will abuse it, which is not actually the usual starting point in a democratic society. Now, that all being said, I have, if you look at my columns over the past year, I have not been at the I haven't actually protested any of the particular judgments because, as you mentioned, the medical need for them or not, I'm not really in a position to judge. But I would say that at the end of this, or a year into it, we're not at the end of it, I would say there's good reason to be concerned for the health of our culture of democratic liberty. And that will require some attention and repair when we're through all this.
Well, on that very phrase, our democratic liberties, I suppose the most commanding feature of politics, particularly in the US at the present time, to some degree here, but I think it will grow, is that traditional partisanship, which is always intense if you're a real partisan, but it really has grown even more astonishingly intense. The partisan divide between Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative is now visceral. It's almost reflexive. And it seems to me that there's no communication or for the middle ground between the camps. What's made, and it comes basically, by the way, out of cultural issues. We're not debating foreign trade or economic development here or there. It's the new social justice movements. And if you're on the wrong side or the right side, it's a fury. What's bitten into us that these camps now almost take on, here's a word from your own institution, they've become the dogmas. And if you fight against the newest dogma, then there's all sorts of punishments. Where are we drifting to here?
Well, that's a big question, Rex. I might challenge your premise a little bit.
Okay.
I think you're correct about the United States. It really does seem, I've got a lot of friends in the United States. Until the pandemic, I would frequently visit. But I mean, it's only a slight exaggeration to say that they sometimes can't even agree to whether the sun is out or not. I mean, it's just a visceral disagreement, almost for disagreement's sake. And that spills over partially through our media into Canada. But I would point out in certain parts of the world, like, in Great Britain, they had an election just before the pandemic began. The Conservative Prime Minister won a big majority, Boris Johnson, but with a coalition that was very new. He had a lot of working class voters who normally voted Labour. So you might say, well, there's a situation where, there was some overlap and cross-partisan work. The Italians just, surprise, elected a new prime minister, and, he got widespread support there. So, but you're right about the United States, and we have to be attentive to the United States because, it has such a great effect on us in Canada. I would say the following has bitten into us, is that the moral worthiness of the opponent is now considered in the first or second instance. And so my disagreement with somebody immediately calls into question his moral or her moral worthiness. He shouldn't have that position, she shouldn't be allowed to speak, etc.
Yeah.
So it's not a disagreement so much about a policy, but about whether this person really belongs, in, fit society. And I would point out that we're talking about a democratic culture, that in recent years, in different parties and in different provinces and the federal parliament, the tossing out of members duly elected from their caucus. So someone runs for office, is elected as a liberal or elected as a conservative, and something transpires and the leader says, okay, you no longer are fit to go with us. Even though that person won election under that banner. And we've sort of, not only have we accepted that, but sometimes we demand it and say that if you don't throw someone out, then you're morally contaminated. So I think that idea of having a disagreement on the principles of it has been subsumed by the idea that the real critical issue is who is worthy to participate. And I might say, to use your language, you use the word dogma. When we talk about religion and the history of religion, either people who are religious believers but have a sort of a healthy self-criticism, or those who are not religious believers and perhaps delight in pointing out the shadows, they identify what they would call, to use a particular word with Catholic residents, an inquisitorial spirit. And that inquisitorial spirit is very much abroad amongst many people who are not religious at all. But it shows you it's not really the sort of inquisitorial spirit has been present in the history of religion, but it's not a religious phenomenon, because we're seeing it today in abundance in many aspects.
Well, no, that's precisely what I was thinking about, according at least to the caricatures that surround the word Inquisition or the institution. Nowadays, within a certain set, I won't say class, within a certain set, someone finds a word from a 15-year-old press release, or digs up a photograph from somewhere else, and because of the immediacies of these particular media that we're now exercising, then a mob gathers, and metaphorically speaking, the steak is in the marketplace within seconds, and X, Y, and Z from the New York Times or from any current magazine or some television person or a politician, it comes down hard, it comes down fast. And I don't think I'm being prejudicial when I suggest that it mainly comes from, in this particular manifestation, the cancel culture. It mainly comes from very articulate people, and many of them more than the other side on the left. This inquisitional thing and the attack on the personality, and he or she must not speak, this is a worrisome phenomenon. I think it is anyway.
It is, and I think you're correct to say on balance it does come from the left. But when there's when a bad spirit is loosed, it doesn't stay in one part of the political spectrum. And
that's true, very true.
If you look back, say, 20 years or so to the use an American example, to the impeachment of Bill Clinton, there were. I mean, it was not a foolish matter. There were serious concerns, but the partisanship that did surround it loosed a spirit that is now quite rampant. Now, that wasn't the only and singular cause, but there's an example of how something changes in its partisan configuration, but that spirit is there. The prosecutor of Clinton, by the way, Ken Starr, when he wrote his big autobiography, regretted all that, and now it's it's come to be much more than even he envisioned. So you might be correct. Well, I think you are correct, Rex, to say that it on the left is where we see that spirit more, severe at the moment. But when you have those when things change the nature or tenor of debate, it's not going to remain on one side. And if that's where it is now, I would add one sort of a clarifying point is that we often say a mob gathers to shout someone down. And we borrow that image from, what happened when actual mobs would gather, to shout someone down in the public square. And that does happen, electronically, but sometimes it's not a mob. Sometimes it's only really a few hundred people.
Yeah, you're very true.
Even a few dozen people, and
I think your qualification is very, very telling. Sometimes there is a mob. If you go into a university and you're the wrong kind of speaker, occasionally there will be a mob. But I'm glad you refined what I was saying, because that's also very true, and raises another point. We don't know where the mob is. It's virtual. It's the Twitter thing, or so, as you say, it might be 12 discontented individuals on a raft somewhere with a few iPhones. But we find from a lot of institutions, and I would pick on the universities here, a lot of institutions or businesses, they shrink in almost immediate timidity when there's the slightest flutter on a Twitter feed. I would take the institution that I disornamented for so many years, the CBC. If they see something on the wrong side of current acceptable ideas flowing in on a Twitter feed, the rabbits jump, and they jump very high. Why are we so timid in defending obvious right when obvious right is present and to be seen?
Yeah, actually, I think probably more than the universities. I would say that to use the common term, self-identified progressive media seems to be the most
Rigorous.
rigorous or sort of arbitrary or quick in their judgments. There are people thrown out of, say, an editor at the New York Times is
Yeah.
deposed. I mean, I don't think more than 30 people in New York actually knew who the editor was. I mean, outside the newsroom of the New York Times. But there was a significant uproar in the newsroom, and out he went. I do think that that's a mistake for media, especially whether the CBC or the New York Times or anywhere else, because if they don't defend the possibility of having another view, and now in these cases, we're not talking about misconduct of any kind, financial or sexual otherwise, we're just talking about, he ran the wrong viewpoint on something. If they don't defend that, then over time, people will stop watching or stop reading. And, I have to say that, if I look at my parents' generation, faithful, CBC national watchers, I gave it up a long time ago because I know what's going to be said almost before they say it. So you need to be lively enough to attract an audience, and that's I think in the self-interest of media. Universities are different; they're institutions. They have different dynamics. But I think on the media end, you have to be lively. And one of the reasons, I'm glad you're at the National Post with. I've been there a long time now. Is that I think that the National Post understands that there's to be a diversity of views is actually good for business. And, in the media world today, you can't afford to do things that are bad for business. There's not much business.
Yeah, not much left. You wrote, by the way, in an appreciation, which I thought was first class, of John Crosby when he passed. I got the sentence here. The dominant effect of television was not to lift up the characters who were not afraid to tell the truth, but rather to create another kind of character altogether, entirely bland, endlessly repeating the same rehearsed points. And just on that last one phrase, A, I agree with the sentiment, but B, the same rehearsed points. When you watch now, almost any of the main so-called panels, and they bring on these communications types, and the birth of the damn talking points that robotically it's driving people mad. And is that a consequence of the medium? We're going back to McLuhan, I suppose. Or is it because politics has become so professionalized now? We have all these expensive, I think rather shallow people calling in to advise the people who are actually governing. It's a strange thing. Crosby, as you pointed out, and as I made a mention, one of the last great characters. I don't see too many of them now. Is that a phenomenon of the medium itself, or is it that politics has become so professionalized and protective?
Well, I wouldn't blame it on television per se, it's part and parcel of the same thing. I would say it's our decision to punish a culture where one slip or one outrageous comment is punished with banishment. I mean, it's impossible. I first started going to Ottawa in the early 90s. John Crosby was still in Parliament. I had the pleasure of going to question period. And when he stood up, it didn't matter what the topic was, everybody would sit forward. They wanted to hear what he had to say. And he, of course, he had great foils, but probably one of his most outstanding interlocutors was another Newfoundlander, George Baker, I think. Yeah. And the two of them would have at it on whatever topic happened to be of the day. But if one of them got a bit outrageous, it was accepted. And if someone had to apologize, you apologize. And that's gone. Now, I would say that when something goes too far, you get a reaction. And the kind of clipped, rehearsed, endlessly repeated, disciplined talking points that dominated for so long, eventually people get fed up, and it produces a reaction. And those reactions have names. In Toronto, the name is Rob Ford.
Yes,
he got elected because he would say things that no one else would say, but many people would think. In the United States, that reaction had two names: Bernie Sanders on the left and Donald Trump on the right. And part of their reaction, or part of their attraction, pardon me, I would watch a Bernie Sanders speech. I would watch a Donald Trump speech, not because I was particularly intrigued, much less attracted by the policy content, but because here was someone who honestly seemed to be saying what he was thinking at that moment. And there was actually a certain entertainment value in it. In Canada, we've had eruptions of it, but there's a danger in things becoming a little bit too clipped, too controlled. The people don't say what they think, but rather what they think other people want to hear. It opens, there's two reactions. One is people turn out, or tune out, pardon me. And then you can get a reaction where someone comes along with a more strident message. And I think in 2016, with Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in the United States, you saw that very, very strongly. Both of them broke all of the rules of political communication.
I'm very glad that you included Bernie Sanders, because it was not just the Trump phenomenon. It's just that Sanders was a lesser personality overall in terms of what he garnered, and that Trump in his own way was so innately extravagant. Well, I'm very interested in this whole question. I agree absolutely with you that regardless of any tones of insolence or carelessness, the thing that most drove, I think, the response of so many, there were 70 million votes in the most recent election, to him was that he's not prepared. Even if what I'm seeing in the landscape of his intellect is not the perfect sunrise, I'm glad to hear what he actually thinks and says. And in Bernie Sanders' case, there wasn't some bafflegab about saving the world or some super nuka. Here's the agenda, folks, and here's what I want. People focused or polarized themselves around Trump so much that they couldn't see the tremendous capacity that was also there. I'd remind a lot of people that he ran against 17 or 18 professional lifetime politicians. He himself was well over 65 when he did so. He was regarded by many as a clown before he even entered politics. And yet this singular and almost unimaginable figure ends up in the White House beating the most prepared candidate in the history of the US system, Hillary Clinton. There's more to Trump than just saying he's vulgar and I don't like the way he is. What were the propellant emotions coming up from the citizenry that gave Trump the tenure that he did own and left him, as we said, even despite all the media opposition, with still 70 million people hanging on to him?
Yeah, I mean, a phenomenon like Donald Trump, and I've written at some length about the many shadows of that phenomenon, cannot be dismissed out of hand if you're going to learn the lessons from it. You have to look at it. My own view is that, the Republican Party in 2016 was unsuccessful, maybe because there were so many of them, in putting down the Trump phenomenon, the professional part of the party. Whereas on the Democratic side, the professional part of the party was successful in putting down the Bernie Sanders and, in favor of Hillary.
Yeah.
One can't know these historical counterfactuals, but I would have preferred if Sanders had beaten Hillary in the primaries.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I think if the two of them had run against each other, I don't know what the result would be. It was a very, very close election. Trump beat Hillary by the narrowest of margins, and even Biden beating Trump by a bigger margin is still a narrow margin. I mean, the country is divided down there. But, I'm not sure if Bernie Sanders had, the Democrats were very afraid that he was too radical and therefore he'd lead to some sort of catastrophe. maybe they're right. I mean, that's their profession. They probably know better than I do. But I think I'd have liked to have seen these two kind of disruptive figures have at it, because when you put up a disruptive figure like Trump against a establishment controlled figure like Hillary Clinton, if you're not happy with the way things are, you might say, I'll prefer the disruption regardless of what it is.
I'll bring it back home now, if I may. I won't keep you too much longer, but there's a couple of bills that you have been seriously writing about in the last couple of weeks, C6 and C7, because they are of such intrinsic significance. If you don't mind, just unfold your thoughts on both and explain what the bills are and so on.
Well, the one that's more proximate to passage is the one on assisted suicide. This was a law that came in 2016 that allowed it for people who were close to death, or death reasonably foreseeable was the legal language, could request a lethal injection administered by a physician, assisted suicide, sort of, if you want to say requested or voluntary euthanasia. There's an ancient, I mean, this is a debate that goes back to the beginning of philosophy, thousands of years. Regardless of your position on that debate, what's happening now is that 5 years in, this is being accelerated rapidly, and what the government is proposing to do is to say that anybody who is suffering, but not in proximate danger of dying, and maybe not in danger of dying at all, but has a condition, can request suicide. So we're getting close. Yeah. We're on the threshold of death on demand. So it's a radical shift. I must say that it is remarkable to me that the federal government, which had other options, would think that this year of pandemic is the time to be expanding radically the regime of, it used to be called, or still is officially called, medical assistance in dying. I think that's a bit Orwellian, because medical assistance is not really about dying, but now that's even gone. There's no dying. It's just anybody who wants death within relatively small parameters. And the government has already indicated that once this bill is passed, which it likely will because it has opposition support, the Bloc Québécois, I believe, and NDP, that the next step is to extend it to the mentally ill. So we're coming very close to medical death on demand, which is a radical shift, and I oppose it. And I've made some of the arguments of why it's a bad idea, even I think for those people who may not agree with me on the philosophy of it. And I think when you put this together with some of the things we've seen in the past year, the principle or the conceptual threshold of triage being accepted in intensive care units, and this really startling rhetorical reversal about the responsibility of the citizenry to conduct themselves in a way as not to burden the health service, which has been a theme throughout the past year. It's become almost a cult-like refrain in Great Britain, I'm sad to say, where protecting the National Health Service has become a national rallying cry, whereas one would think the National Health Service was there to protect the citizenry, but it's the other way around. When you put all those things together, we're not that far away from people hearing, either implicitly or explicitly, look, your duty here really is to not burden the service of healthcare service. I'm very worried about that. The other bill deals with what's called conversion therapy. This is a practice in which people who have usually, I suppose, a sexual or a homosexual orientation, same-sex orientation, or undergo some therapy to have a heterosexual orientation. The degree to which this is actually practiced in Canada is not known. It seems it's hard to find actual examples of this done by the medical profession. But nonetheless, it's become quite a rallying cry to ban this procedure. The federal government's bill is very wide-ranging. It bans advertising it. It bans charging for it, even if an adult wants it. It bans it for children. It bans going abroad. So it bans a lot of things about this. It's much more restrictive than any regulation of healthcare that I'm aware of.
Mm-hmm.
But the point that I wrote about was more, let me say, I hope unintentional part of the bill, but I'm skeptical that it's unintentional, but let's say I hope it's unintentional. The language of the actual law is so broadly written that it would be illegal for anybody to counsel a minor
Mm-hmm.
to do anything that might reduce or diminish either a homosexual orientation or homosexual act. That's what the law says, which means, as I put it in my column,
Mm-hmm.
if a 17-year-old minor high school student came to me and asked what I thought about, shall we say, a promiscuous sexual lifestyle, and I said, you should stop that. If the person was heterosexual, say a young man betting many women, that would be okay. If it was a young man with a homosexual orientation, it would appear to run afoul of the law. Now that just is simply absurd. I can't believe that's what the law, what the drafters wanted. Now, our Justice Minister, David Lametti, says that's not at all what this is about. But when he says it's not at all what this is about, but the law, the legal language makes it clear that it is, I would be more afraid of the law that's passed than what the Justice Minister says. And on that issue, I think that many people, I think reasonable, or understandable reasons think, oh, this is not such a big deal. It's really putting restrictions around a very marginal practice, and it seems to alleviate maybe some psychological abuse of people. That's not what this law is. That might be what people started out thinking it might be about. But this is actually a very broadly law. I cannot believe that this law is constitutional, but we find that out after the fact.
This brings us right back to actually where we started outside of John Paul II. Brings us back to the idea that under a COVID governance and a scatteredly attended parliament and a habit-forming reflex of accepting things that just simply are announced, that you have issues of the highest potential morality, assisted suicide, that, if I may put it this way, drifts somewhat hazily in the background while we wait for the latest announcements for the lockdowns. I know I could chatter on forever, but I think I've abused you enough. All I want to say at the end here, Father de Souza, is thank you for your time and for the graciousness of your manner.
Very good. It's a joy to be with you, and I'm sure that our viewers would agree that it was better when we were on radio.
They would agree with me better if we weren't around at all, Father. Anyway, you take care of yourself.
Very good. Thank you, Rex.
Thank you, sir.
God bless. Thank you.